This is the DJI Osmo Pocket 3, and as fantastic as it is out of the box, there's still some settings we have to change in order to maximize our creativity. In this video, I'm going to show you the different video, photo, and audio settings to make sure you get the best footage, but also are able to quickly change between them with a few simple clicks. Stay to the end for the custom settings I use to adapt for shooting on the fly. You see, I start off using this camera to just be able to hit record and vlog, or even document my behind the scenes processes. But the more that I continue to use this, the more I want to replace my own gimbal that I have here. If there's anything that I need more of, it's smaller gear that do powerful things. And this Osmo Pocket 3 gimbal is one of those things. Why take this big gimbal when I can take the small one? And the footage I'm showing you here are out of the Osmo Pocket 3. And here are the settings that I put together to get these shots. First up, let's go ahead and tackle our functional settings. And what I'm referring to is just these top settings over here. So we're gonna take the top and slide it down, and we're just gonna work our way down over here. So for the first one, we got the custom settings, but we'll talk about that later on. Over here, we have this automatic record as soon as we flip things over, but we're not gonna do that. I usually like to go ahead and leave this off, as I don't want to go ahead and start recording right away. This is a personal preference, so if you like to just capture on the fly, go ahead and select that. And then here are all my custom settings that I already have, and you can go ahead and hit one of these if these are the settings that you want to record at any situation. For me, I usually go by the last settings. All right, let's go back. Brightness, I usually leave it at 100%. Hasn't been a problem for me for battery life. But of course, if you're in lower light situations, you can go ahead and lower the brightness, but I'm gonna keep mine at 100. This toggle right here is for face tracking for selfie mode. As soon as you have selfie mode enabled, when you go ahead and triple tap or triple click this joystick, the camera will swivel around back to you and it'll automatically start tracking your face. I like to have this thing on, as when I'm vlogging, I may be holding the camera out in front of me or even off to the side, so I want to just always be tracking me. If I was composing my shot in a particular way, I would turn this off, as it will mess up your pan and tilt because it'll be tracking you. Going down here, we can go ahead and select how we want our gimbal mode to be. I personally like to keep mine as follow. So pretty much anytime that I go ahead and swivel my camera, it'll follow, whether it's the tilts or even the pan. But if you want to go ahead and lock off your tilt, we can go ahead and use the tilt lock mode, which pretty much just has you worry about panning. But you can quickly lock off your axes just by pressing and holding your joystick when you go ahead and do your move. So I just choose to keep this off, or I just refrain from using this mode. And then of course we have this FPV mode, which pretty much gives the idea that you're using like an FPV drone where you can go ahead and freely fly around your camera, which is nice because it's got a nice wide angle lens. But unless we're particularly wanting our footage to look like that, again, I'm just gonna go ahead and swivel back to follow. All right, let's go ahead into rotational speed here. And we have 3 different modes. If you want it to look more smooth and cinematic, then sure, go ahead and use slow. Otherwise, for like everyday vlogging, I would like to go with default. And of course, maybe for like action scenes or for action sports, you can go ahead and switch to fast. It might just be a little jarring, but if that's the effect that you're going for, then go ahead. Otherwise, default's okay for most people. Over here, we got our orientation, which is our portrait, auto rotation. For me, I like to go ahead and keep it on auto rotation, which pretty much depends on the orientation of the screen. So if I want to keep my footage landscape, I have to keep my screen like this. Otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and hit continue as I have it folded up, and now my footage is going to be vertical. All right, let's maximize our screen real estate here. And now let's go into the settings, the main settings here. For our wireless mic, when we have our wireless mic, we can go ahead and use this, but we'll tackle that in a little bit. The gimbal start direction, you can choose forward or backward or whatever the last setting was. I often like to keep mine backward, but if you're vlogging on the fly, let's go ahead and keep it on last setting. The rotate screen, 2 seconds is good enough for me. If you're gonna go ahead and automatically shut this thing off, I just flip the screen and it turns off. For the slider control, I like to keep mine on gimbal. This is in case I want to make some tiny adjustments with how my shot is set up. But of course, if we go ahead back to the main screen here, we can go ahead and tap the side, tap that zoom that was just here. Now we can zoom in and zoom out, and then tap that. And now we can go ahead and move our gimbal like so. Okay, going down. Look, it still winds up being zoom, but don't worry about it. It'll still go back to gimbal. For selfie flip, it's pretty much a mirror mode when you have the front facing camera. For me, I just leave that off. But if that helps you in the way that you film, by all means, flip it on. For the built-in mic audio backup, I like to keep it as on, which pretty much has the recording on this device while using the wireless microphone. And that just makes sure that in case something happens to my wireless mic, or in case I need a different perspective, as far as maybe I hand this camera off to somebody else and they want to talk behind the camera, at least we have that dialogue, we have that crisp audio, the best audio that we can get. You just won't be able to have this setting on other modes that aren't the video mode. Okay, OTG connection. This is mostly for people who use this as a camera or a webcam of some sort when using an Android phone. I'm not using Android, but you can explore those settings on your own. Wireless connection, we don't need to touch that. If you want to connect this to your DJI Mimo app, then it'll walk through those settings for you. Otherwise, for wearable mode, unless you're using this camera on a backpack strap of some sort or chest mount, you don't need to activate this. But pretty much you can go ahead and operate your camera using the screen, but we're not using that right now. For my joystick speed, I like to keep my zoom at 7 and my gimbal at 7, just the right amount of speed for me. But of course, if you want to slow things down, maybe perhaps for your gimbal, you can go ahead and slide that down as well. Video compression. So pretty much the size of our videos when we're normally recording without the D-Log or any picture profile, you can go ahead and use H.264, which is pretty much normal for everything. But as soon as we use those picture profiles, they efficiently switch to the HEVC. But by default, we'll leave it at H.264, which most people's computers and phones and devices handle perfectly well. Sounds, I like to keep this as off. I like to be incognito. I try not to draw too much attention to myself, so mute. For composing my shots, I like to go ahead and enable these reference lines, particularly the grid. But if you want to go ahead and get those cinematic bars, or at least where those cinematic bars would go for this particular ratio, 2.35 to 1, then you can go ahead and enable that. But for me, mostly for behind the scenes stuff and the occasional vlogging, I don't want to enable those bars, and I don't need to get the framing for that. This thing does have time code, but yeah, I don't need to use that as well. But it's great to know that you can go ahead and use this. Let's say if you need this as a safety angle for a wedding or some kind of event, you could stick this on the back of the room, have this with the battery bank, and then just sync up your time code. But we're not doing that. Naming management, that's to your own preference. I just left it as default. Screen off when recording, leave it at never. Auto power off, 5 minutes is okay for me. I mostly use this with the DJI battery grip, so battery hasn't really been an issue for me. The LED, which you can find right by the joystick, I like to leave that on. And that's pretty much it for our main settings there. Let's move on to photo settings. All right, so exit here, switch over to our video mode on the bottom left corner here. Now, starting off with our aspect ratios, or pretty much how the format of the photo goes, we can go ahead and swipe from the bottom up. And we got 16:9, 1:1, which is pretty much a square. We're just gonna go ahead and leave it at 16:9. Of course, this will change once you go ahead and have that vertical orientation, as if you were shooting with a phone. But otherwise, we'll go ahead and stick to 16:9, and we're gonna leave the timer or the countdown off. We're gonna be able to access the bulk of our settings by swiping from right to left. And I like to shoot with manual exposure, but with also having a auto white balance, which makes sure that the whites stay white and your skin tone looks pretty good, as opposed to looking too yellow or too blue in environments that may force that look on you. Meanwhile, I like to go ahead and use a continuous shooting mode, but if you want to go ahead and isolate a particular subject, using single mode autofocus is good for that. For our format, JPEG is the default, but I like to shoot with JPEG and RAW just to be able to have that flexibility of editing in post and being able to go ahead and stretch the data of my darks, my lights, parts of the images, my midtones, and all that good stuff. When we go ahead and hit exposure, of course, you can leave it on auto, and then you can go ahead and let the automatic ISO do its thing. 50 to 3200 is good enough for me. And then depending on how bright your image is, you can go ahead and tweak how bright and how dark you want your image. But by default, you're most likely just going to go ahead and leave it at 0.0. As someone who shoots manual mode most often, I will leave this on auto ISO, and then I will also leave this by default 1/240. Or then I can go ahead and crank this up a little more, maybe to at least like 1/250, or perhaps 1/2500th of a second. But for now, we'll just go ahead and leave that 1/240 there. If you're confused about how we even got that menu, you can just go ahead and tap that pro icon there. All right, let's move on to our video settings. Gonna tap this down here and move over to video. Now we got different video settings, but these are the ones that we're just gonna mainly tackle. Let's begin with first adjusting our resolution and our frame rates. So 1080 24 is pretty much default. This is what I would use for talking heads like this. But of course, if you want higher resolution for things like cropping in or punching in without losing much resolution, 4K is the way to go. And then of course, if you want to go ahead and get more slow-mo action out of this, or at least having the option to slow it down in post, while still having the audio, we can go ahead and shoot at 60 frames per second. And that, again, goes with the other resolutions as well. But most often, talking heads, 1080 at 24 frames per second is good. If you want a little bit more slow-mo, use 60 frames per second to be able to slow it down in post. And you can choose any format that you wish for that. 1080 has been more than sufficient for my needs with this camera. If you notice, you can also change the format here in the top right-hand corner. 1:1, which is pretty much a square. And that only goes up to 3K. When you go ahead and shoot in vertical mode, the highest format that we can use for that is also 3K. All right, if you go ahead and look over to our left side here, we have these smart modes. We have the face auto detect mode, which was related to that face tracking mode that we had in that top menu before when we first started out. Here, this is more for when you are behind the camera and you just want it to track you, or perhaps you just want to turn this feature on when using the selfie mode instead of using that toggle from before. That will be able to follow you or anybody's face. The dynamic framing, this is great if you want to go ahead and not only track your face, but also have it in a particular part of the frame. So let's say I'm walking a particular direction, but I want to keep myself on the right side of the frame. I can go ahead and select that. And then I can go ahead and use the joystick to select perhaps like that part. So whatever is in this part of the frame right here on this side of the camera, literally, it'll go ahead and track that particular person or object. Most likely person. I haven't tracked other objects, but pretty much it would keep my face or the subject on this part of the frame. But we won't be doing that. So we'll exit that. And then of course we have our spin shot here, which it will automatically consistently have a spinning shot for you. All you have to do is just choose how many degrees that you want it, and then it'll just spin for you. Or spin the other way. And that depends how your camera is oriented as well, so keep that in mind. Now let's go ahead and use our main settings over here. So again, we are going to access this by using the Pro button here. I don't use any of these glamour effects or these other adjustments that we have here for image. Yeah, all this stuff. Sharpness, noise reduction, I leave it at 0. All this stuff I would do in post, if anything. But most of the time I just accept it as it is, and I find that it's just good enough for me. So we go ahead and hit Pro, and we make sure that this little aperture here is highlighted. Again, I mostly will leave this at auto white balance. Keep my whites white. The color here, by default, I leave it at normal. You can go ahead and choose other picture profiles here, or different color modes here. Image adjustment default. Focus mode, I leave it at continuous. But if you want to go ahead and show a product, you can go ahead and use product showcase mode, which allows for the autofocus to ignore your face and focus on the product right in front of you. But if you're using continuous, unless you block your face with the product, it's still going to keep your face in focus. And then single shot, this is great if you want to keep it at a kind of top-down angle or at a particular angle where you don't want it to focus on anything else. Perhaps you want to focus on a subject in the foreground while the background is a little busy and you want to prevent the camera from focusing in and out of that. So single mode would be good for that. But for the most part, when filming myself, continuous is the way to go. Glamour effects again is off. And then exposure mode, because I want to go ahead and honor what they call in the filmmaking world, the 180-degree rule, where our frame rate, which is 24 frames per second, will have a shutter speed of twice that. So, which would be 1/48th of a second, but we don't have that here. So we're going to have it at 1/50th of a second, which helps maintain that motion blur. And then we're going to also have a auto ISO here, auto ISO, however you like to say it, of 50 to 6400. But for me, up to 3200 is actually good enough for me. If it will let me select it. Okay, and confirm. Now, if you're not using things like ND filters, perhaps you want to go ahead and change this to auto, or if you want to go ahead and switch this shutter speed to a higher number. And that's totally fine too. I mean, if you're just using it for vlogging, for documentation, it shouldn't really matter what kind of shutter speed that you want, whether or not you want to go ahead and follow that 180-degree rule for you casual users, and that's fine. And that's good for now. And of course, there's more settings like this that we could set up for our custom settings, but I'll reveal that to you at the end so that you can go ahead and just quickly switch back and forth between all those other settings that I have here. All right, so those were the main video settings, but let's go ahead and move over to the other video settings like low light. So this would be dedicated for, of course, low light situations. And you'll notice that things are a little bit different here. Like, yes, we can kind of get similar frame rates, but you can see that we don't go beyond 30 frames per second. But again, for me, that's perfectly fine. It's mostly about talking head. If you want more action, you want to have a very well lit place, whether you got studio lights or just any lights in general, and you would go ahead and use normal video mode as opposed to low light mode. Low light mode, you would probably use it like in a Christmas village with all like the different lights that you have. You pretty much use it at nighttime. So for our pro users, you can go ahead and notice the difference when we go over to the right, use the pro settings here enabled, go over to our exposure, and our ISO doesn't just go up to 6400, but it actually goes up to 1600. And depending on the light that we have available in the situation, yeah, you may want to have it all the way up to 1600. And maybe it won't look as grainy, or I'm sorry, as noisy, like seeing all those speckles in your image. And that's up to taste. But for me, as much as possible, if I can keep my ISO to 3200, I like to keep it there. But at that point, I don't even use low light mode. I just go ahead and use whatever I can in the regular video mode. That's just to make you aware of what you're dealing with and what you got here. But let's move on to the other setting here, which is slow motion. Now keep in mind, in slow motion mode, we're just getting slow motion right out of camera. We don't have to put our footage through our video editing software where we have to go ahead and manually slow down the footage to a certain percent or a certain duration. So when you go ahead and look at our resolution and our speed here, we have all the way up to 4K, 120. And for me, that image quality looks great out of camera, nothing crazy about it. But if we stick to 1080, we can go all the way up to 240 frames per second, which is ridiculously slow. But again, in these kinds of shooting modes, you want to have a very well lit place. I would prefer to shoot this in a daytime setting, but of course, if you're well lit, why not? Maybe just be cautious of any flickering depending on the lights that you're shooting with. Again, depending on the shot that you want, if you want the clarity, 4x speed, you won't be able to access this setting until you update your firmware. So just keep that in mind. We're going to swipe over to the right here, and we won't be able to play with much here, but we are able to go ahead and manipulate our color mode. I keep it as normal, but again, if you're going for a particular, you can go ahead and use D-Log or HLG. I prefer D-Log. That's just the way that I prefer to color. Continuous mode for sure, unless again, you want to keep this as a still focus. If you want a single point focus, having things in the foreground. And pretty much I'm just gonna follow auto. But if you want more pro control, go ahead and switch to manual. And if I'm using 240 frames per second, the minimum would be 1/240th of a second. But normally, because of 180-degree rule, I would use 1/480th of a second. 480th, yeah. 1/480, pretty much. We don't have that, so 500 would be the way. And then control your ISO and prevent your image from going in and out, light to dark, controlling the ISO. So again, it depends how your image looks. You ideally want to get this value to 0.0, but of course, whatever looks good out of the screen to you, you be the judge of that. Hopefully you're a little more familiar with shooting in manual mode. Otherwise, it's totally fine. Just keep it on auto. No shame in that. Okay, now for the time-lapse setting, we got different options here. Right? We can have the hyperlapse option, which is great if you want to like film in a car or film on a train and you just want to have your camera set up. You can go ahead and choose your speed here. This is all preferential. I don't have a particular taste for any of this stuff. Time lapse, same thing. This is most likely like being able to change your auto white balance settings as well. So you can go ahead and change these different things. It's up to you how often you want to have these time lapses, which pretty much is great if you want to go ahead and monitor those things that was mentioned down there, like the sunset, the sun going down, crowds, clouds, all that good stuff. Personally, I like to go ahead and have like probably every 3 seconds or to every 5 seconds. And then because I'm not sure how long I'll be able to stand around doing these time lapses, especially when I'm traveling in places like New York. Yeah, we'll take a couple photos, but at the same time, you know, not everybody just wants to sit around and watch you do a time lapse. So perhaps I'll just do like 5 minutes or so. So for motion lapse here, we have the option of having the camera go from left to right or right to left, which is what LTR is, RTL is. So just so you want to get a good perspective of what's going on. This is great for landscapes or even in crowds and events, just like setting up to breaking down. So you can go ahead and set those parameters as well. Let's say it'll take you like an hour to set those things up. Of course, if it doesn't take you as long, you can go ahead and stop this recording short. Now let's go ahead and stay in our video mode and look at our audio settings. So if we go over here and swipe over, you notice that there's the microphone icon here that we can click as well. And we want to keep it on stereo. And I like to keep my noise reduction on, as well as have the directional audio as all as well. So we got the front, the back, and we're just gonna get both sides getting recorded. We're gonna have left and right being recorded, and we're also going to be able to have good noise reduction, especially when we don't have a place to have a wind muff on our device. But of course, the best way to rock audio is the DJI Mic 2, which is paired with this when getting the creator combo. So if you have this mic, you can go ahead and turn this on so that we can go ahead and access those audio settings. And as you see, it has already paired. It's been connected quickly and efficiently. All right, let's go ahead and swipe over here. And once we go back, you can see that the microphone icon that was meant for the camera is now switched to the icon of the DJI Mic 2. So right now we have it set to mono. We can't do nothing about that. For the transmitter gain here, we're just gonna leave it at 0. But of course, if you're in a loud place, perhaps you wanna go ahead and keep it at a lower volume, just like a tad bit. If you wanna mute the transmitter, you can go ahead and do that as well. But most often, I would just go ahead and turn this guy off if I'm not using it. And then of course, noise reduction is on. Pro tip, if you didn't know, you could also hit record. You can start recording with your microphone just by going ahead and hitting right above the power button. And that'll easily start, stop. And then of course you can already record separately by hitting this button here, the record button in red. And if you remember, we still have these settings from the top here. And if we go back here, wireless mic, as you can see, it's already picking our wireless mic up here. And then for us to be able to enable this transmitter too, we need another one of these, which it did not come with the creator combo, and that's fine. The monitor volume, I keep this default at 50. Perhaps you can go ahead and listen in to what the audio levels are like if you plug in a USB-C adapter into the USB-C port of the camera. I like to keep the LED on, vibration on for feedback, audio to sync, which pretty much refers to be able to record the audio separately, and then you can sync it up in post. So I will actually have an audio file in the camera and also in here as well in the transmitter. And then I could connect both of these to my computer and drag over the files. For low cut filter, I'm gonna go ahead and turn that on just to be able to just cut those humming noises and whatever low frequency noises that may be happening during my shot. The 32-bit float, this is pretty much giving a wider dynamic range of what's being recorded. So there's going to be some flexibility in case my audio might be too high or my audio might be a little bit too low. So at least I can kind of have more grace when it comes to saving my audio. More often than not, I really don't pull off any audio from here. And whatever comes out into the camera, whatever is synced to the camera, I can go ahead and use OK. So I'm going to go ahead and format my transmitter from here, which is very helpful instead of having to plug this into my computer and format it that way. And last but not least, let's go ahead and dive into our custom settings, shall we? So if we're going to go ahead here in the bottom left-hand corner, let's go over to our custom modes and let me tell you my reasoning behind this. So for my first 3 custom modes, I have it pretty much set at the same settings, but different white balances. Now, if you're familiar with operating some pro cameras like the Sony FS5, you may know that it only has 3 set white balances. So 2600 Kelvin, 5500 Kelvin, and maybe like 6500 Kelvin, somewhere around there. So if you're shooting in a room that has tungsten lights and just has overall warm lights and you want to balance out your white balance, you can go ahead and use a lower Kelvin, like 2600 Kelvin, and be okay. So one of the ways that we maintain our creativity while still being able to get the best image quality is to manually dial down our settings, or dial in our settings. So across our first 3 custom settings, we're going to go ahead and have 4K 24 when we slide up and just achieve that. When we swipe over, we have a 2600 Kelvin for our white balance. We use D-Log because I'll be using this in post, and I'll be dialing in my look, continuous autofocus. And for our manual exposure here, 1/50th of a second, following that 180 degree rule. And then I would actually dial in my ISO manually. So depending on what the scene is, I'll go ahead and keep it at a particular ISO so that I prevent the image from going dark to light, light to dark. And so it has a consistent image overall wherever I'm filming, but I'll dial that in later. So of course I have this already programmed in, but for you, you would do this, you would dial in these settings in the video mode here, and then you would go up here, swiping down, hit this person over here on the left-hand side, and then you would be given this option where it says C1, and that's where you would go ahead and plug that in. And then you would go ahead and repeat that for C2 and C3, where I pretty much had the same settings, but just changed the auto white balance to manual white balance. And then I left it at 5600 Kelvin and 6500 Kelvin. So for our last custom setting over here, I have it set to my vlog settings, which I usually use at 1080p, 24 frames per second. And I left down auto white balance, normal color, it's 10-bit. And then again, 180 degree rule, and then go ahead and set it to 50 to 3200, and then save our custom settings there and just overwrite. Now that we have all those settings, we can continue to make our Pocket 3 more functional with these 7 accessories over here.